In this tutorial, we're going to cover setting up your tournament schedule for your fantasy golf league. So at the top of the page, you'll notice that there's a setting for breaking your league into separate segments. By default, this is checked. You can uncheck it if you don't want to create segments for your league. We'll leave it checked for our example. And what this does is this allows commissioners to break up the long season into smaller chunks. And by doing this, you can view standings by each individual tournament. And if you set up segments, you can view standings by those segments. And then you always can view the standings by the season as well. So a lot of people will set up their leagues to break up the standings in their payouts into separate segments, just because the seasons get to be long. The next setting on this page is for setting a weekly deadline. By default, if you don't check this, the weekly deadline will always be the start of the tournament. And we recommend just leaving the default as the start of each tournament, because this sometimes can cause confusion for people trying to set their lineups and not understanding why their deadline is passed. But if you do have a league where you want to set the deadline every Wednesday at 10 p.m., you can do that by checking this option and then setting your day of the week and then the time that you want your deadline to be. For example, we'll just leave this unchecked. So if we scroll down, this is where we have our list of tournaments, and you'll see that I have some tournaments checked off already. So the first column is whether or not we want to select the tournament for our league. The second column is the tournament that we want to start a segment with, and then the third column is ending a segment. The fourth column is for allowing roster updates. These are all defaulted to checked for our example because we chose earlier to do weekly selections. So our league, every week you'll select new golfers. And since we're selecting new golfers every week, this gets defaulted to true. And then the last column is the special event indicator. So if we scroll down, you can see that I selected the Sony Open all the way through the Valero Texas Open, and then I did not check the Puerto Rico Open because that week there's two tournaments on the same weekend, and I don't want to have the Puerto Rico Open in my league. But you could choose this, and then if you did choose this tournament, your team owners would need to choose the rosters for each of these separate tournaments, and they'd have to save a separate roster for each one. But for this example, I won't check that second tournament. And so for setting our segments, what we want to do is we always want to start the very first tournament that we select. We want to set that as a starting segment. If you don't, you'll end up getting an error because every tournament needs to fall within a segment. So the Sony Open will be the start of our first segment, and then we're going to end our first segment with the Genesis Open. And then by default, whenever you end a segment and you're going to start a new one, the new segment should always start with the next tournament. So the Mexico Championship, we'll go ahead and we're going to set that to start our segment. And for this example, we'll just do two segments. So since the second segment is the end of our season, we're going to end it with the very last tournament in our schedule. So the Valero Texas Open will end segment 2. And then, for example, I chose to set the Farmers Insurance Open as a special event. And what that will do is that'll indicate that this tournament's a special event. And if you have any special rules set up for your roster selections or your scoring, the special event will have those applied to it. So that pretty much covers the tournament schedule and setting that up. One last thing to note is you'll want to look at the dates all the way to the right to determine when there are two tournaments on a particular week. So like in my example I mentioned earlier, the Mexico Championship, you can see that starts on February 21st, and the Puerto Rico Open also starts on the 21st of February. So that's an indicator that you have two tournaments that weekend, And if you don't want to have your team owners select golfers for both tournaments, you want to remember to not select both of them. That's pretty much it for setting up your league schedule. The next tutorial that we'll cover will be setting up your scoring settings.